Man who had two sons. No, this is not the start of a bad joke. But it is a story that is well known to us, with many layers of meaning etched into it. Like someone who tells a good joke, though, and they won't explain the punchline, what this story means is not explained to us. There was a man who had two sons. Our minds may jump to other sons we have heard about in the Bible: Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers. There are lots of stories to think back on. But unlike many of these other brother pairings in the Bible, in this story, the younger son is not painted as the good guy, but the older brother isn't either. So instead of resorting to simplistic interpretations and letting our eyes glaze over because we've heard this one before, go with me as we take on the challenge of seeing what this well-worn text might hold for us today, in this space and in your life. For those of you who prefer visual learning, I invite you to gaze at the painting, even though I realize half of you can't see it and there's glare, so come look at it later. It's a Rembrandt, and it tries to depict this story. Looking at this painting, we ask together, what are the characters in this story? Where is God, and where are we? Jesus often plays on his listeners' familiarity with something. He would take a story that made sense and felt like real life. He draws us in, tapping into our own experiences. There are lots of characters here. There are the three main stars: the father, the younger son, and the older son. As a youngest child, I can easily insert myself there. If you ask my older brothers, I was spoiled and I knew how to get my own way. But there is more here than birth order to draw us in and to identify ourselves with one of these characters. Have you sown your wild oats like a younger son? Have you nurtured a child who has turned away from you and your love like the father? Do you harbor frustration, jealousy, or judgments towards others like the older son, feeling like you have been overlooked or misused? What in this story calls to you and draws you in? There are others here with more minor roles. There are the slaves and the hired hands. They are the message bearers, and interestingly, the ones that the sons compare themselves to. Jesus tells us this story, and we may also see ourselves as the hearers of the parable. Either the Pharisees and the scribes pushing Jesus to justify his actions, or there are tax collectors and sinners. We may see ourselves with them, sitting with Jesus, sharing food, and feeling the disapproving eyes of those in power. And there are those who are sidelined, almost as props in this story. there's the citizen of whatever country the younger son went to, and there are pigs. Do we feel like we are on the outside looking in on these parables, or on the outside looking in at life itself? And there's one last group, those who are unnamed yet implied. The disciples who heard this message while sitting near Jesus and following him. And those in the story that are never named and we're left wondering about, like the mother. Where is she in this father-son drama? We are not told how we are to see this scene or who we are in it. So where do you see yourself? We may assume that we know who God is in this story, but that is never pointed out. Throughout time, we have called this story the prodigal son. But who really is the prodigal? Prodigal means wasteful extravagance, or one who spends or gives lavishly and foolishly. If we look at this story with that meaning of prodigal in mind, it could be the son or the father. The reading we had today, there were 3 verses at the start of the chapter, and then we skip over 8 verses that tell both the story of the lost coin and the lost sheep. And it makes me ask, who is lost in this story? If we place ourselves with the younger son for a minute, how do we feel? After he has taken his half of the father's wealth, gone to a distant country and squandered it, he ends up feeding pigs and longing for someone to offer him something to eat. What I find most interesting here is that when he comes to himself, he practices a phrase that he could say to his father. And once he returns home, he says these words to his father: "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands." What are the voices that we practice to ourselves? What do we repeat to ourselves about our own self-worth or our needs? Some think that the son was not truly repentant, but slightly conniving, knowing that his father would take him back. What words do we say to God because we think that is required, instead of the true confession that we really need to speak? Luke is a master at capturing stories and retelling them to us. And in this parable, there are several repeated phrases and themes that emphasize things that we may need to pay attention to. The father welcomes the younger son with a phrase that then he repeats to the older son. "For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." The father does not repeat the wrongdoing, but repeats his joy and that the new life and at this restoration. Do we let that voice repeat in our heads? God celebrating because we have been found. If we do see God as the Father, then we see a God who keeps coming towards us. When the younger son approaches, the father runs out to meet him. Filled with compassion, the father puts his arms around his son and smothers him with kisses. And also with the older son, who has stayed, still working hard. The older son who hears the music of the party and instead of rushing in to join with this kind of excitement, he hangs back angrily. Here too, the father approaches with openness. The father goes out to the older son and pleads with him and listens to his concerns. In this father, we see images of God going out, God reaching out, God opening a door of welcome, God throwing an over-the-top party. Imagine being able to hear the dancing from outside. That is a party. God longing for reconciliation with us and for us. We are about halfway through our Lenten journey. On this road through the wilderness, traveling towards the cross and Easter. In Lent, we are often invited to give something up or to take something up. This intentional setting down of something is meant to allow us space to focus on our relationship with God. As a woman, I have often struggled with giving things up in Lent because I feel like our society asks or pushes me at every turn to be less, smaller, quieter, to give up more of myself and of who God has made me to be. So the practice of taking up an activity has been much more helpful. How do I take up a practice of only speaking to myself positively? Take up giving myself space just to be, instead of always needing to do or produce. In this Lent, we have been asked to focus on our hunger. How are we in touch with our hunger? What do we long for, and where is that hunger coming from? Looking at this parable through the lens of hunger, I can see where the lectionary was going this Lent. The younger brother hungers for possessions and getting away. Then the land itself has a famine, the earth mirroring the waste and lack of means that the younger son has, painting a dire situation. The son is in what feels like a helpless state as he looks at the pig's food eagerly, and yet no one gave him anything. Then he can name his hunger, and he realizes that his father has bread. When the son gets home, the father kills the fatted calf and celebrates with meat and eating. Then enter the older son, and part of his argument is that he has not even been given the smallest animal to eat with his friends. He even uses the language that his younger brother has devoured his fortune. Hunger and longing are things we can relate to. Real hunger in our bodies, but also longing like the brothers. Longing for freedom and adventure, longing to be seen, valued, affirmed, and recognized. The Father is also longing to bring his sons home, to welcome both of his sons and draw them into the warmth of his embrace, to reconcile them to himself and to each other. What in ourselves have we lost or surrendered that we are now hungering for? How is God coming to us in that hunger? Are we welcoming God or pushing ourselves away from the table, staying outside the party? For both sons, they have to find their confession. The Father always comes towards them, but what is the response? And the text does not answer this. We do not see how either son responds. I've been having conversations about baptism with several people lately. And this past week, we circled back to how baptism is a turning away from something and a turning towards God. How are we letting our hunger turn us in the direction of God, a God who comes towards us in our hunger, and not a hunger that sends us towards things that do not satisfy? As we keep looking at the characters in this story, I wonder how it would feel if we swapped the genders. What would it feel like if this was a story about mothers and daughters? How does that change the feel or the resolution? Many fathers in the Bible welcomed their children, loved them, and gave them bread instead of a stone. Yet, we live in a world where macho attitudes project onto males something that robs them of their emotional connections and the depth that they really do have. So how does it feel to see a daughter walking down the road and a mother running out to meet her? A mother's love, a mother's compassionate embrace, a mother longing to meet us, a mother's love, a mother's understanding. As we look at this story, who are you and who is God? The words of today's psalm are matched beautifully with this prodigal story. While I kept silent, my body wasted away, though my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength dried up as by the heat of summer. Then I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not hide my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave my guilt and sin. And hear the response. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you. Do not be like the horse or the mule without understanding, whose temper must be curbed with a bit and a bridle, else it would not stay near you. Many are the torments of the wicked, but steadfast love surrounds those who trust in the Lord. May we abandon any stubborn selfishness and fall with trust into the arms of our loving parent as we find our confession.